So this was why I was in Chief Smith's office back when I was a park ranger. We were working on Trail of Tears exhibits for Fort Smith, and we did a panel for each of the 5 tribes, and this was the Cherokee panel that we worked on. And I was given permission to write the panel by Chief Smith and the historians for the nation at that point. So this was a partnership with the National Park Service and Cherokee Nation, and we created this panel. We put original Cherokee artwork by Cherokee artists on it, and I'm as proud of this as anything I've done in my whole career, because it was just special to be able to tell those stories and talk about the importance, the deep tragedy that the Trail of Tears was for the Cherokee Nation. Yet, also it says there, I learned the phrase, survive and thrive, right? That's what the Cherokee Nation is known for. So this is kind of my credential of why I want to talk about these things. So Fort Smith's story and the Cherokee history out here goes back. It goes back before 1817, but in 1817, Fort Smith was chosen as a location for a fort, and it was in a line of forts that was on the western boundary of the nation. It's hard to imagine that Fort Smith, Arkansas, was the western boundary of civilization, but it was at that point. And if you know anything about the history of Oklahoma and Indian Territory and the Cherokee Nation, of course, this was the extent of the nation for a period of time, the United States. And there were forts, Fort Towson, Fort Washita, and then up north of us you've got Fort Scott, Kansas, and then you go up to Fort Atkinson up in Nebraska, what became Nebraska. You go all the way to Minnesota, and you've got Fort Snelling up in the Minneapolis area. Those were a chain of forts that were all built on the western frontier at that point, that kind of came across the front of the country. The reason Fort Smith comes into existence where it does is because of the federal government's relationship with the Cherokee Nation, and the fact that they've moved. Voluntary is a word that's used in history books, and we all know it wasn't voluntary, right? So I'm not going to use it. But the removal in the beginning was put on to Osage land. Okay, this was land that the Osage Nation viewed as theirs. They had agreed to vacate it, and then the Cherokees came here, and then that created issues. It created issues over being able to feed their people and what time of year they came here. It was territorial issues, and then the Osage and the Cherokee get into a conflict. At the end of the day, it's the federal government who's responsible for causing this conflict between these two peoples. And that's the problem. So Fort Smith is created to keep the peace, okay, and to try and stop these two tribes that they've created this conflict with into doing this. So it should be called Fort Long, not Fort Smith, in my opinion. This is Stephen Harriman Long. He's the guy who chose the spot for Fort Smith to be created, and it's on the bank of the Arkansas River where the Podo flows into it, and that's kind of important as a geographic location. But we called it Camp Smith and Fort Smith after the guy that was in charge of the military district. I guess Long didn't have a large enough, he wasn't ranked high enough to get a fort named for him. He does have a mountain in Colorado named for him, though. Was probably named something before that, though. This is what the garrison at Fort Smith looked like. It was a small post. It was created in 1817 and it operated until 1824. And in that 7 years or so, the fighting between the Osage and the Cherokee somewhat subsided, and so you could say that they achieved their mission of peaceful relations. I do have a picture here. It got tense in 1821 when Skiatok or Mad Buffalo, this is Osage war chief, he threatened to attack Fort Smith, and he brought 500 warriors just opposite of Fort Smith and almost rolled in there and attacked it, but the garrison persuaded him otherwise, and we didn't have a battle at Fort Smith. It's funny how we're going to have that a little bit later in the 1860s, but that's as close as it got, and kind of how that came to be. So Fort Smith is going to cease to exist as a military outpost in 1824, and the Army is going to relocate up here in this closer to this area. You know where that is, right?
Gibson.
Fort Gibson. Fort Gibson is going to be created in 1824, and the soldiers that were at Fort Smith are going to come up here, and they're going to help build this fort. So we have I have friends that work at Fort Gibson. I've known people there over the years. We've done events at each other's sites, and we share a common history there. We have that heritage. So that's kind of interesting. Arkansas. Well, I'm an Arkansas boy, so Arkansas is we're kind of known for our politicians, right? Yeah, we got some politicians. We got some. That's not a value statement. You can put, it's fine with me, however you feel about that. We've had some politicians, and we had some back then, and they wanted the economic benefit that the military would bring back in the Fort Smith area. They were kind of sad that they lost their fort. This is something that's played. We've got fighter pilots coming from all over the world today to Fort Smith to train on the F-35 that are flying out, and those are pretty loud. I don't know if they end up over here circling around, but they make it pretty loud for us in the Fort Smith area. But the military is part of that story. So in 1838, the politicians of Arkansas make a case, and they get the Army to come back to Fort Smith, and they're going to build a new fort. The man who was in charge of it was Zachary Taylor. He was a major at the time. Taylor was a West Point graduate. He was a solid Army man, and he thought it was ridiculous that the government was going to spend money to build a fort where they really didn't need one. That's how he felt about it. But he's got to follow orders, so he does that. He's stationed at Fort Gibson, but if you know anything about Fort Gibson, there was a lot of disease and a lot of sickness there because of its location originally down by the river. And, well, Taylor didn't want his wife and his children running the risk of getting sick over here at Fort Gibson, so he kept them at Fort Smith. He didn't like Fort Smith, but he kept his family over there. He's going to build the fort. And from 1838, the second Fort Smith is going to be known as the Mother Post of the Southwest. It's going to be, it's really up as far as you could get steamboats on the Arkansas River. So that's going to be very important. They're going to bring supplies there, and then they're going to take them in wagons to these other forts in the region. They're also going to deal with, of course, the Trail of Tears and all the things that came with that there as well. So this is what the second Fort Smith it looks like. It's a much larger post. And this is also what it's going to look like in 1865 at the end of the Civil War when all of these things that I'm really here to talk about are going to occur. So I wanted you to have that. I wanted you to see a little bit of background. This is my hometown. This is where I grew up. I worked at the National Historic Site for the Park Service at this location for about almost 10 years. And it's been a part of my own story, and I just can't tell you what an honor it is to come here and talk to you about it, and talk to you about your connections in Cherokee Nation with Fort Smith. It's not a pretty story. It's not a happy story necessarily, but it's an important story, and I think it's something that we all need to understand. Does that make sense? Okay. That's the introduction, by the way. I'm a history professor, and what I did yesterday was give tests all day, and what I did till midnight last night was grade those tests. And I'm happy that I'm not going to be giving you tests today because I don't really want to do any more grading until later in the semester. This is one other credential that I bring here for you. I'm going to talk about the Civil War today. I'm going to talk about the Cherokee Nation and how the Civil War divided the Cherokee Nation and how you had soldiers wearing the blue uniform in your membership, and you also had tribal members who were wearing the gray uniform. And I'm showing you that I wear both uniforms because that's my story. That's my family history. Even though I'm not Cherokee, I've got people that fought on both sides, and I don't begin to tell you what we need to do with this. It's hard. It's a hard time to discuss. It's 150 years ago, actually a little bit more now. But have we gotten over it? I'm gonna ask some of those rhetorical questions at the end of this program. Is it still with us? Absolutely. Yes, it is. And are there still effects of it? Yes, there are. And I think, these people are going to get A's in my class right here because they're jumping right in. This is Amen Corner right over here. But anyway, I wanted you to see that because I've got ancestors from Georgia that went all the way to Appomattox Courthouse, and I wear that blue uniform because I've got ancestors from Arkansas who fought for the North. Who's a bigger rebel? A Southerner from Arkansas who joins the Confederacy, or a Southerner from Arkansas who fought for the North? I think that took more, maybe a little more guts. I don't know, or I don't know what you call that. Okay, so here we are. So I want to talk about I'm going to talk about three events that I know of very, very well that are going to kind of make my case here for the consequences that the Cherokee Nation and the other tribes faced at the end of the Civil War, especially in relation to how they were treated in Fort Smith in 1865. And the first one is Pea Ridge. I'm not gonna diagram the whole Battle of Pea Ridge for you. You've probably been over there, or you can go over there. It's a national park battlefield. They do a wonderful job of interpreting everything there. But one of the things that we know, and these are facts, and these are well-known facts, and you can read these things in the history books. You don't have to take my word for it. But one thing that we know is that there were Confederate Cherokees that were part of the Battle of Pea Ridge, and on the part of the battlefield that they fought on, they were under the command of Albert Pike. Albert Pike is a whole interesting story in his own right. Pike is another connection to the Drennan story, and I made that case the other day. But Pike's going to end up being the Confederate emissary to the tribal nations out here in Indian Territory, and especially he's going to work hard to get the mixed blood faction of the Cherokee to support the Confederacy, and he's going to be successful in that part of it, and that's going to have consequences. But what we know is that there was a scalping that occurred on the battlefield at Pea Ridge. This is a fact. This is a well-documented fact, and it's pretty clear that it was probably Wade's troops that were responsible for this. And this is Earl Hess. This is Earl Hess quote. Earl wrote. He's a historian. He wrote the definitive book on the Battle of Pea Ridge. This is a quote straight out of his book. He says the scalping at Pea Ridge represented the first of 4 documented cases of mutilations, battlefield mutilations during the Civil War, and they shocked the Northern people and embarrassed the Confederate authorities, including Albert Pike, who was in command. This is going to affect Pike the rest of his life. My point in this is not justifying or demonizing. That's not my point in this. It's warfare, and he was a Confederate general, but there's a Confederate general that said war means fighting, and fighting means killing, and killing comes in a lot of forms. So that's not my point here. But my point is that the fact that this shocked the Northern people and it embarrassed Confederate authorities and even the overall commander, they weren't really expecting this level of violence. Now, when you talk about the Civil War west of the Mississippi, it's a different war than it is back there in Virginia or back there in Pennsylvania. And I make that case in a whole other program. And I see some people nodding with me, so you know what I'm talking about. It was rougher. It was harder out here in a lot of ways. But this is important to understand. And the fact that people are going to remember, people read this in the newspaper, oh my gosh, and this was going on out here. And again, I'm not pointing fingers, and I'm not, this was part of the culture, but that culture didn't always translate very well to certain circles in northern cities, if you follow my lead on that. So, Pea Ridge, you got the largest battle fought west of the Mississippi River, and what do most people remember about it? What a lot of people remember about it, they remember this one incident. There were medals of honor, there were acts of bravery on both sides of the line. A lot of stuff to talk about, but this one thing is what people remember, or what a lot of people remembered, and that's going to it's going to bring consequences. You see my point? Okay. That's enough about Pea Ridge. The second event, and these are all going to occur in Arkansas, by the way. Well, actually, one's going to occur in Indian Territory right opposite of Fort Smith. It's a much smaller one. But the second one is also in Arkansas. It's in 1864. It's 2 years later. But this is at the Battle of Poison Spring. This is part of the overall, what historians call the Red River Campaign. This is a time where federal troops were focused on trying to go down along the Red River and isolate Louisiana and Texas and completely control Arkansas away from the rest of the Confederacy. It failed miserably because Confederate forces were much better equipped and much better led than anybody estimated originally. So it was a failure from the federal standpoint. They lost a lot of battles, they lost people, they lost supplies and equipment. And it showed that in the spring and summer of 1864, the Confederate troops in the West were in a lot better shape and a lot more willing to fight than people thought they were. But the bottom line here is that the Battle of Poison Springs, which is one of the battles in a series down there, you had USCT troops, you had colored troops is what they called them. These are black soldiers who fought for their own freedom during the Civil War. They were fighting for their own emancipation and their own people's rights, and you kind of have to admire that because they have a little bit different reason than fighting for this thing called the federal government, whatever that is. But the bottom line here is you had black troops who were on the battlefield. Some of them are going to try and surrender because they're going to be overrun by larger numbers of Confederates. And the Confederate Army had listed they called it the Black Flag Order. They had refused to take prisoners in black troops. They would not treat them as prisoners of war. They saw them as slaves. They saw them as less than human. They saw them as not a valid soldier out there. That's not me. Those are not my opinions or my guidelines, but those are the facts. And as such, they massacred. It says massacre in there a number of times. They slaughtered, they killed, and very violently a lot of prisoners who died. Had been prisoner or were wounded, and there was evidence of this. Because the federal troops are going to end up back in that area, the battlefield's going to change hands, and when the federal troops get back on that side of the field, it's going to be clear. There are clearly documented cases of this atrocity occurring. And it's ugly. And it's one historian, Greg Irwin, is a good friend of mine. He's a professor of history at Temple University up in Philadelphia. Used to be at UCA in Arkansas. He taught in Arkansas and then went to greener pastures in Philadelphia. I don't know, do they have pastures in Philadelphia? I don't know. But the bottom line is, Greg Irwin says that this was really horrible. He calls it an orgy of barbarism. He makes the case here that this was a really ugly thing, and it's been remembered. Probably the biggest atrocity that occurred on Arkansas soil, and we have some race riots and other things that occur in our history. They don't rival Tulsa, but we have some of our own history that is pretty bad at other times. Greg Irwin says this is the worst it got in Arkansas, and since I'm from Arkansas, I pay attention to those things. But so here's another case of this. Confederate troops responsible for some atrocity and some really shocking things on the battlefield. It's going to end up in the newspapers. It's going to be in the mind of the people, especially who end up winning the war. Are you with me? I always check with my students, make sure you're with me. Are you with me? Okay.
Are you?
Huh? I got you. Yeah, you want to be at this table, but you're over here. Yeah, I see how that works. The third event is something that you don't know about, and it's something that a lot of people at the time, this didn't make the newspapers. This didn't get the headlines, so it's not going to stick in the mind of the North like the other events did. People in the North, if you watch the movie, the latest movie that's ever been done about Abraham Lincoln, right? Poison Spring is discussed at the beginning of that movie. Abraham Lincoln's sitting on a porch, and he's just gotten news about Poison Spring, Arkansas. That's part of the movie on Lincoln that's pretty recent. So that's a big deal. This is Flat Rock. This is probably in the Moffett-Muldrow area, right across the line from Fort Smith, is where this occurred. And this is not Private Henry Strong, but Henry Strong was my master's thesis at the University of Oklahoma. His Union diary. Maybe I can come back, Catherine, and talk about Henry Strong someday. That would be kind of fun. And we sell a book or two while I'm here. Who knows? But yeah. But I'm not really about that. But Henry Strong mentions that on September 16, 1864, he's in Fort Smith with the 12th Kansas Infantry, and they're going to be called across the river because elements of the 1st Kansas Colored, which was a black regiment, of course, and the 2nd Kansas Cavalry, which was a white cavalry regiment, some of their soldiers are going to get jumped and slaughtered and actually kind of massacred in much smaller number because they were cutting hay, and the Confederate forces under Gannot were on their way to Cabin Creek. So you know about the Battle of Cabin Creek up the road here. Well, they got caught out there with much smaller numbers, and they massacred at least around 30 soldiers, killed them. No prisoners, didn't take any wounded, didn't care for them, killed them all in the field, and it was very clear that happened. So here's a much smaller event, but this was the way the warfare was conducted out here. Okay, I made my case. There's three instances right there. So three chances to do that. One's out of a diary of a guy that I know very well, and he has no agenda. He's writing a diary for his own purposes, and he's writing about what happened. And I don't think he's lying. I think he's pretty clear about it. So here's what. Let's fast forward. 1864, another year. The war ends. Right? Robert E. Lee surrenders. The war ends. Robert E. Lee surrendered, so everybody's done. Wrong. We're going to see that played out here. But what happens is the war is winding down at least, and then Abraham Lincoln gets assassinated, and that throws the whole country into a big mess. And we're going to talk about the effects of that and how that plays into this. But what happens here is there's going to be a meeting, the tribes, because federal authorities are back. And by 1865, the federal army is back in the Indian Territory, and they're back here. And this is important to understand. They've been gone since 1861. The war started officially in 1861. In 1862, where's the federal authorities in Indian Territory? Gone. Where are they in 1863? Gone. They kind of come back and they fight down here at Honey Springs, and we can talk about that. And they kind of over here at Fort Gibson, but every place else, you better be wearing gray or you're going to be in trouble, right? You understand that? 1864, federal authorities, still kind of gone. Okay, 1865, they go, okay. So they send emissaries to the tribes. This is the guy that gets the job right here, Lieutenant Colonel Asa Matthews. He's the guy with the sword here. His commanding officer there is General Francis Herron, who was a Medal of Honor winner at Pea Ridge, which we already talked about. But he's the guy in charge of the territory. He tells Lieutenant Colonel Asa Matthews, you need to go out here and you need to round the tribes up, and you need to talk to them because the federal government needs to lay down federal authority back to them now that they've been in rebellion. Interesting. And so that's what he does. And he's going to try and have a meeting, and they're going to get some people together out there in the Oklahoma City, what is today Oklahoma City area, way out west from Cherokee Nation, Choctaw Nation. There's going to be a meeting scheduled for June at Armstrong Academy in the Choctaw Nation. They're going to agree to send they're going to agree to send commissioners to D.C. after this. Matthews gets there late. He misses the meeting. He calls the meeting and then misses the meeting in the Choctaw Nation of the 5 tribes and the others. And that doesn't even happen. So what they end up doing is they end up surrendering on their own. And what you see is the Choctaw Nation is going to surrender. The Confederate forces of the Choctaw Nation, keep in mind there were Unionists in the Choctaw Nation, right? They were loyal Unionists. We were talking about how difficult that is to discuss. Loyal to what? Loyal to whom? I think that they were faced with a very difficult situation. You had the United States at war with itself. What does that do? What does that do to somebody in the Choctaw Nation? Which side do you choose? Both of them are probably bad at the end of the day, in the interest of the tribe. So you got to keep that in mind. Same thing for the Cherokee. Cherokees are going to surrender in June 23rd. That of course is when Stan Wadey recognizes the last Confederate general to surrender in the war, and the Chickasaws are going to be even after that in July. So it's going to be July. The further away, you got issues there. They're going to discuss a new meeting in the Cherokee Nation, in the Choctaw Nation again at Armstrong Academy for September 1st. There's confusion that goes with this. I got it up there in capital letters, and nobody seems to know when it's going to be exactly or where it's going to be or who's going to be invited. And the Secretary of Interior gets involved, and here's where Lincoln's assassination comes into play here, and I think it's very, very important. Abraham Lincoln dies in April of 1865, and he gets replaced by Andrew Johnson, who is his vice president. Everybody knows this history, knows enough about that. So we know that Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction before he died, and even some of the stuff that was happening while he was president, was much more conciliatory and probably lenient is the word that I would use against the South. He wanted the country to get back together. We've been fighting this war. We've been losing all these lives. We've been tearing all this stuff up. It's time to stop and rebuild and go forward. Lincoln was about going forward, but he gets assassinated and he can't do that. I know Lincoln did some stuff up there in Minnesota and he ordered some other things, so I'm aware of all that history, so I don't want to get into that. But in general, I think that especially the Cherokee Nation would have got a much better deal out of Abraham Lincoln's administration than they're going to get out of Andrew Johnson's, and that's what I'm going to make the case for right here. Andrew Johnson, Secretary of Interior, is going to order that the tribes are going to sign new treaties, number one. Well, they have treaties. Nothing has changed. The federal government is the one who withdrew from Indian Territory in 1861, and part of the treaty said that they would stay here and they would defend this area and they would help these tribes and these people if something like a war came up. Where were they? They withdrew. They withdrew their forces. And then they come back and they want to oh, by the way, you're going to sign a new treaty now. There's going to be new rules, new things. So you see how that works? So Lincoln probably wasn't going to do that, probably wasn't going to do it in that way. But the bottom line is they're going to scrap the Armstrong Academy meeting for September 1st, 1865, and they're going to relocate it to Fort Smith. And the 5 tribes are pretty clear about this. When you read their response, they're like, we don't like this, but the only person we can deal with legally is the Secretary of Interior, according to the United States government, and we kind of have to go. So they made the effort to be there. They kind of had to. The Secretary of Interior said, let's do this at Fort Smith because we can get supplies there by the river. We've got better accommodations because it's a bigger town than the Armstrong Academy area of the Choctaw Nation, and we got telegraph service, and that was correct. I mean, Fort Smith had been on the telegraph line since 1860. It had been chopped up a few times during the war, but generally you had telegraph line, which is the Telegraph Road, which extends through northwest Arkansas, right through Pea Ridge Battlefield, all the way to Springfield, Missouri, where it goes through Wilson's Creek Battlefield, and then eventually to Springfield, eventually to St. Louis, and eventually to points on the East Coast. So there you go. Telegraph line was important. Washington, D.C. is included in that. All right. So we're back to your history professor stuck here. 99 years, okay? I was born in 18, I wasn't born in 18. Sometimes I feel like it, you know, I live in the 1800s. Catherine probably is nodding, she lives in the 1800s sometimes. I know it better than today. I was born in 1964. I was born 99 years after this event. But I still feel a connection to it because it's my hometown. I know what happened there, and I know the town is. I know the town probably better 99 years ago than I do today, and it's more familiar to me. So here we are. They're coming back to Fort Smith is the point I'm making here. You know, we have all this history. Fort Smith and the Cherokee Nation, Fort Smith and the Choctaw Nation, all the tribes, the Trail of Tears. It's not real happy, right? It's not real warm. They're being drugged back to Fort Smith again, okay? And it's not going to be once that court gets going and the gallows get going. We got that whole chapter, which I know you guys have heard about, right? There's plenty of scholarship on that topic and how that played. So bottom line is here they are coming back to Fort Smith. That's the point I wanted to make here, and that's the point I'm from Fort Smith, so I kind of understand this. I thought this was interesting. By the way, I consulted no less than 6 books, a number of online articles, and a lot of resources to put this program together, plus the knowledge I already had that I've gathered over the years. And every 6 books, none of them tell this the same way. Yeah. You think historians have it all together? We don't. We need to all sit down and get on the same page sometime, but that's never going to happen. But the bottom line is, it depends on when the book was written, depends on when the scholarship was done, depends on what the political opinions of the writer was at the time. All kinds of bias and stuff comes in there. But the bottom line is, I thought it was funny. And I was laughing. My wife is like, "What are you laughing about over there?" She knows I'm working on this program. I'm like, well, it's kind of funny that nobody agrees what happened in Fort Smith. Here's what I think happened. Very quickly, a delegation from the Kansas tribes, the tribes up in Kansas, they're going to arrive in Fort Smith. Well, what are they doing in Fort Smith, right? I'm going to tell you in just a second. We're going to get there, but they're going to arrive pretty early. They came early and got a seat at the table, and here they are. Okay, so we'll talk about that. All the whiskey in town is going to get confiscated. This was written in the newspapers. They didn't want liquor flowing. And a Professor McGowan is going to arrive from the East Coast. I've been trying to figure out where he came from and what school he taught at. But he was a professor, and he was specifically in the newspaper listed as someone who was trying to learn more about indigenous language. Not a bad choice. Going to have a good opportunity for that. So that's kind of a good thing to study some of this. And then you had correspondence from the New York Tribune. I didn't get Tribune capitalized, and the New York Herald. So here's what their papers looked like in 1865. The two biggest newspapers in the country. The Times wasn't mentioned, by the way. Maybe the Times was probably bigger. I don't know. But the Tribune and the Herald, two big New York papers, they're going to send people to Fort Smith to cover this event. It's a big deal. So preparations were made. The dignitaries on the government side are going to arrive, and the government dignitaries are Dennis Cooley, who's Commissioner of Indian Affairs. So he's one notch under the Secretary of Interior, and he's the guy who has the agenda for the federal government. He's the guy that's going to call the shots for the meeting. The U.S. Army was represented by William Harney. I could spend a whole session telling you about how horrible and evil that man was and what kind of soldier he was. It's incredible, the stuff that he was involved in. But I won't do it, but I'll just tell you, they didn't pick a respectable guy. They picked a guy that I have issues with myself. Colonel Eli Parker is down here in the bottom left. Parker was a member of Grant's staff during the war. Is he Delaware? Seneca. Yeah, so Eli Parker, he kind of well-known figure in that time, but they sent him down here. Maybe he had an interest or not. And then Charles Mix, who's also been negotiating and been Mix has been in the mix for quite some time in Indian affairs and all that, if you pardon my pun there. But those are the government dignitaries. I say dignitaries. Those are the government officials. I should probably change that. They're the ones who are there to call the shots. And then you're going to have representatives of the tribes. And there were so many, and with the factions, I didn't take the time. Again, I was grading papers, so I don't have pictures, and I don't even have all their names. But I'm mainly trying to make the case of how they were treated, and you can go back and read who came and who spoke. Catherine, I was going to ask you something. One of the reasons I called you yesterday was, what's the nickname for Elias C. Boudinot that you have? You told me that y'all have a nickname for him or something. Huh?
For EC?
Yeah. I was trying to remember. He's buried in Fort Smith, and he was very outspoken on the Confederate side of the Cherokee question here at this conference. And he's going to also do a lot of speaking. He was a lawyer, and he was very eloquent and very educated and all that. But I remembered you had said we call him something, and I was like,
well, we don't take on
yeah, I got you. I was just curious. So Cooley's going to get all the representatives there, and here's the other thing. You remember the meeting that was scheduled for Choctaw Nation for September 1st? Okay, there's a lot of people that think that's still the case, and all the pro-Confederate, all the pro-Southern factions of the 5 tribes thought, hey, we're meeting down in the Choctaw Nation on September 1st. When they go down there on September 1st, where's everybody at? There's no meeting here. This is going to start on September 8th. Well, it takes a little while to get up here from there. We jump in a car and do it in a few hours today. Back then it took a lot longer. And they're going to start heading to Fort Smith, but in the meantime, the meeting's going to start. And so you've got the pro-Union factions of the tribes who are meeting in Fort Smith, as they've been called to do, because they've been told to, and they've got to figure out what's going on here. The pro-Confederate people haven't shown up yet. Does that make sense? It's going to be kind of a problem, So Cooley starts off, and he says, the Great Father in Washington, D.C., I guess that's the president he's talking about, right? He sees you as his erring children. I've got that in quotes. That's what he says. We're going to start this off really well, right? You're the erring children here, but he's willing to overlook, your transgressions because we need to get some business done. And here's the business we need to get done. You're going to sign a new treaty, all of you. It doesn't matter if you're Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, Seminole, Osage, Quapaw, Caddo. It does not matter. You're going to sign a new treaty, and you're all going to abolish slavery and agree to do that. You're all going to adopt freedmen into your tribes. Talk about that in a second. You're also going to conduct measures of peace with the Plains tribes, who you have kind of issues with, different lifestyles, competition. There's all kinds of stuff that goes back there. And the last thing is, oh yeah, by the way, you're going to accept a form of territorial government that's going to unify all Indian lands. Oh my. You know, that's a pretty stiff list. But that last one, I mean, some of those others were, you could maybe swallow some of that, but you can't swallow that one. You know, no. Cherokee Nation is the Cherokee Nation. The Choctaw Nation is the Choctaw Nation, and that's the way they saw it. That's the way it had been, and that's the way it should have been. It was messed up. So I'm agreeing with you there. This is what Cooley said, and he's only saying it to the loyal people who stayed with the Union in the first place. These are the guys that kind of, somewhat, sort of on his side. Should have been, maybe. I mean, anyway, I think you see the problems with this. So historical point number one. I'm going to make some historical points here. I don't think I numbered all of them, but I started out that way, and then I didn't go back and fix my slides. But this is one of the historical points I want to make. The tribes at this point, the tribes in Fort Smith, Arkansas, in September of 1865, are being held to guidelines or whatever you want to call it, that were more strict than President Lincoln or Andrew Johnson had even expected on the South as a whole. Okay, they're expecting more out of the tribes than they do everybody else. Well, that probably sounds familiar, doesn't it? I mean, I'm with you. I know the history. And I think that's an important point here. Books could be written on just the Fort Smith Council, and they haven't been. It's always kind of a side note, and like I said, nobody can agree on what exactly happened there. But this is pretty clear to me. And the fact that had Lincoln lived, this might have been a whole different situation. I'm not saying that the tribes would have been treated fairly or well, but the bottom line is I think they would have been treated differently. Okay? And that's important to understand. So, the loyal factions made it very clear to Cooley as soon as he said all this. And again, the pro-Confederates haven't even shown up yet. The loyal factions made it clear they're not in Fort Smith to sign any treaties. We're not here to do that. You didn't tell us that was from the beginning, and we're not doing it. And we're not authorized to do it in the first place, the people that are here. The people that are here are authorized to make peace with our tribal brothers who we've been fighting with in your war for the last few years. That make sense? That's the only thing we're here for. We're here to sign a peace treaty. That's the treaty we're supposed to be doing. And so that's what they say. And they say further, treaties have been violated. The only treaties that have been violated here, I mean, Cooley said, you guys violated treaties, you joined the Confederacy. Clearly, there are Cherokees who did not. Clearly, there were Choctaws who did not. And on and on. Cooley said they did. They said, no, we didn't. And if any treaty was violated here, it was the federal government that violated it because they pulled out of Cherokee Nation and the rest of Indian Territory in 1861. Okay? So there's the problem. Laurel Creeks, Osage, Quapaw, Caddo, Seneca, Shawnee, Cherokee, of course, Seminole, Wyandottes, and Chickasaws. Those are your largest and most significant participants in this discussion. Because the argument is also made among the loyal factions that since the federal government had pulled out, that they had no choice but to entertain. The only government that would talk to them was the Confederate government. The Confederate government made some promises. They weren't real good ones, but they made them. You see where I'm going with that? They even said, "Hey, wait a minute," and I said so. So the tribes were guilty of no crime or errant ways, as Cooley had stated. They believed that, and I think they're totally correct in that. The federal government was the one that was really at fault here. But if you can get the federal government to admit fault, man, talk to me, and we'll be millionaires or billionaires. So Cooley is going to change his tone. He's there. He doesn't even have the pro-Confederate people here. He's like, uh-oh, we got a problem. I'm not going to be able to accomplish what I've been mandated by my boss to get done here. So he's going to change course. Okay, and what he's going to do is on September, they've been arguing this out since September 8th. They get to the 13th, and Cooley's going to say, "Hey, let's back off this new big treaty and all these big issues, and let's talk armistice." So that's going to be complete, and the Confederate faction is going to show up a little bit late to the game. They're going to talk about this on the 13th. The loyal side is going to say, "Yeah, we'll sign," and they actually sign. And then on the 15th, the Confederate faction arrives. Okay? Because they had been told the meeting was going to be in the Choctaw Nation. Oh, and they're kind of mad about that. They're like, "You're having the meeting and we're not here?" You know? Can you understand their position? Oh, you've been having a meeting. Oh, you've been dealing with what's going to happen in Indian Territory now. We're kind of a part of that, aren't we? Or maybe not. Did we forfeit that? We missed it if we did. You see my point here. It's ugly all the way around. They're going to arrive unaware of the previous meetings, and not only that, the tone of the federal government. They were as shocked, and you can read their writings, and I'm not going to throw it up here for you, but I'm going to tell you to go look for these things. They were as shocked, the pro-Confederates were as shocked as anybody that the federal government was throwing this big blanket that everybody in the tribe had supported the Confederacy. They were like, "Hey, get a load of this. Look what the federal government's doing. They're treating everybody like they're treating us." They kind of looked at that, and they saw a silver lining in that, I think, to a degree. They're going to also express their own displeasure with the peace treaty and everything that Cooley did, and that's pretty clear. And that's what I was talking about. Elisha Budnot, he's going to be one of the outspoken voices of the pro-Confederate side, and I mentioned he's buried in Fort Smith, Arkansas, by the way. So that's kind of interesting. So the Confederate, Cherokee, and Choctaw responses, they're going to refuse those stipulations that I put up there earlier. They're going to refuse the Freedmen question. We're not going to deal with that, and they're not, obviously they're not interested in any territorial government having reign over them either. It didn't matter if you were pro-Confederate or pro-Union. Nobody wanted that, and that's pretty clear. I was making that point a while ago. The Choctaws are going to deny that they had any official relationship at all with the Cherokee Nation, and historians are kind of like looking at that. Well, there was some stuff going on under the table, but there was much less than the negotiations you had openly that some of the other tribes had. So they're going to deny, and then the other thing they're going to do is they're going to say at the end of the day, "Hey, and by the way, the southern states, they had the right to secede anyway." That was the Choctaw Nation's official standpoint. Yeah, you're at a Northern Union meeting, and that's, by the way, we want to go on record. There you go. Okay, that's what you want to say. Good. Cooley's going to realize the impasse in all this, and he's going to be completely frustrated. And when he has a boss that he has to answer to, that's not a good situation. So he's going to do something. He's going to call for adjournment. He's going to adjourn Sine Die, Latin for indefinitely. We're going to talk about this later. That's what Congress does. This is a Congress thing right here. I knew you would love that. Right in the middle of all this craziness we got right here. Yeah, Synod, yeah. Latin. We're going to use some Latin on you since nobody understands that. We know what that means. It means when you get around to it, when you think we've forgotten it, all those kinds of things come with that. So that's what's going to happen. So, what do we have from the Council of Fort Smith? It's adjourned. Let's talk about some of the effects, and I want to get back to some of those consequences. Some of the effects, we have a really nice painting that was done after the fact of all the wonderful people who were this is hanging in the Oklahoma State Capitol, right? Did you know that? There's some discussion of maybe the idea of the name Oklahoma even came from the Fort Smith Council meeting. Did you know that? Kind of interesting. I haven't been able to fully substantiate that, but that's what I'm hearing. Here they are, dressed nicely, all sitting around a table. The pro-Confederate people and the pro-Union people and the government representatives. They all just look like they're getting ready to have a nice cappuccino and bagel, and not get any of it on that map right there, as they discuss the territorial government that's going to be over Indian Territory. Now, I'm being real sarcastic here, but I think that's important to do. because that's not really what's happening. And I bet these meetings were a lot more heated. And when you read the newspapers, it did. There were a lot of opinions expressed, and nobody was really happy. And the bottom line is they weren't happy with how the federal government was treating them. Yeah, I know that's hard to believe too. So, back to historical observations. One of the books that I really enjoyed pulling some of this information from was Cherokee Civil Warrior Chief John Ross and the Struggle for Tribal Sovereignty. It's a fairly recent book by W. Dale Weeks, and he talks a lot about John Drennan's position. John Ross's position. John Drennan just runs out of my mouth before I can do anything. But he talks about Chief Ross's position on this. He's a part of this. He comes to Fort Smith in the middle of it. I don't have time to develop this, and it's not really my place probably. But there's a lot of issue with the two factions. The two factions that go back to the treaties and the Treaty of New Echota and the Treaty Party versus the folks that were against that. All of that is a part of this too. But Ross's position in this is pretty important. But I want to get back to some of my original points here and make sure I hit these as hard as I can. Lincoln's assassination and the subsequent shuffle of the cabinet officials and the resignation of William Dole. William Dole was Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and Lincoln and Dole together had been at least what I would say is judicial. And they were pragmatic. Those are the words I use in that middle section there, in how they handled Indian affairs. Andrew Johnson's administration is all over the place. It's a mess. There's no. All it is what the federal government can grab, what it can take, what it can mess up, and we know that that's the case sometimes. So that's important to understand. And Cooley is an instrument of the Johnson administration. The second thing is they're in that judicial and pragmatic treatment of the Lincoln administration. Most of the people in the tribes and most of the tribal representatives and the people that are involved here, they have no idea that this switch has occurred. Okay, this was something that happened that they were like, we didn't see that coming at all. And I go back to the Cherokee Confederate response and the Choctaw Confederate response. When they got to Fort Smith, the last thing they thought was that the pro-union factions were going to get like decorated and paraded in Washington D.C. and be given homes in out on Martha's Vineyard or something because of what they did. They thought they would be celebrated, and they weren't being celebrated. And that was kind of a shock to them. So this shift is apparent after the Fort Smith Council, and the effects were felt at the time. They really weren't prepared to respond to it. Does that make sense too? So they're in shock. They're like, what do we do now? The climate has changed. The relationship with the federal government and the tribes has changed even once again. That over and over again. But it's just one more example of that. And how do we navigate that as a people, for our tribe and for our tribal members in an effective manner? So I think that's, at the end of the day, and I've been talking for a while, I've been talking kind of fast, I'm running out of time, but I think that's at the end of the day what we're trying to get at. In 1866, they're going to end the adjournment. They're going to call everybody back. They're going to call the tribes back to Washington D.C. and then this is where they're actually going to lay the law down. So the treaties are going to come in '66, and of course representatives of the Cherokee and the Creek and the Seminole nations, they're going to give freedmen the freedmen citizenship in 1866, aren't they? Just leaving that out there for you. Choctaw and the Chickasaw Nation are going to only be encouraged to adopt the freedmen into their tribes in 1866. Kind of interesting. I kind of picked and chose what I wanted to talk about there and have some fun with that, but there you go. All the tribes are going to agree to compensate pro-union members for their service. So here's the reward that they got for being loyal Union citizens in the war. They did get a pension. They're also going to agree to the provisions for a north-south and east-west railroad across the Indian Territory. Oh my goodness. The railroad's coming here now? Eminent domain? Okay, the people of Arkansas didn't want the railroad in a lot of ways. They were just fine with that river. And the railroad was going to complicate, and the railroad companies are going to grab and steal, and that's going to happen out here? Yeah. Oh, and then the other thing was, we're gonna carve off some of your western lands because you don't really need them anyway, and we're gonna give those to the Plain tribes. That was the other thing that came with this. And again, I don't have a in Arkansas a dog in this fight. That's what we say over there, but I say over here too. But man, that's what the Treaty of 1866 is going to get accomplished. So I have questions for you. Where are the Cherokee today in all this? I don't expect you to have to answer those right now. You can do it on your essay exam before you leave the building. Will the consequences and wounds of the Civil War ever be healed? I don't know. We're 150 plus years later. Some of this stuff is alive and well. 2021, they're still arguing about freedmen. The Cherokee Supreme Court decided in 2021, if you didn't know that. I know that too. What does all this mean to the Cherokee people? What has it meant? You know, those are questions that I would ask you, and hopefully you're inspired maybe to dig in and look at some of these issues in more detail. Has the government today changed its tune on treaties and things? Well, you know, I live in the 19th century most of the time, so I kind of have to stay in the 19th century. That's where I operate most of the time, but it definitely changed a lot back then, and they changed their tune often. And that's not, I didn't come here and tell you something that you didn't already know in that regard. But specifically as it applies to Fort Smith and it applies to the end of the Civil War, there were consequences. And there were consequences of those things whether you were involved or not, whether you chose to be loyal and stay with the Union or not, or neutral, or move to Texas and live down there while this war's being fought. You still had to come back to the Cherokee Nation and deal with the consequences of it, and there were consequences. That's my point. Yeah. So I'm going to be quiet, and that's going to conclude my program, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. I wish it was more fun and more lighthearted, but these are heavy issues. I've tried to make them, kind of try to poke at them when I can, but the bottom line is they're hard things, and but you have a hard history. When I'm saying the Cherokee Nation has a hard history. Yet you've survived and thrived, and that's the really cool thing about it. So thank you again for the opportunity today.